Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap with me, Philip Ingram. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and now present Times Radio Frontline. And we've got a number of different videos that I want to point you out this week. But of course, as ever, I recommend that you go and watch or listen to all of our episodes because they're all very good. The first thing I want to have a look at is the Ukrainian delegation coming out of the talks that they had in Istanbul with the Russians yesterday.
The priority number one is to organize a meeting of the leaders of presidents where participation of President Trump and Erdogan will be most valuable. A real ceasefire and end to all strikes on civilian infrastructure. This can be a crucial first steps towards lasting peace. We propose to the Russian side to hold such a meeting of leaders until the end of August. By agreeing to this proposal, Russia can clearly demonstrate its constructive approach to everyone around the world, including our partners. Ukraine keeps insisting on a full and unconditional ceasefire as the necessary basis for effective diplomacy. We are ready for a ceasefire now and to start substantive peace negotiations. And it is up to other side to accept this basic step towards peace. Real steps are possible, and other side must demonstrate a constructive and realistic approach. We will keep working to achieve this.
I need to add an additional sentence to that, and that's an important thing. We do not exchange children, and we do not exchange civilians. The civilians and children must be returned.
Now, in this, we have the Ukrainians calling for a summit of 4 leaders later on in August. And those 4 leaders are Vladimir Putin, President Zelensky, Donald Trump, and the Turkish President Erdogan. Now, this is interesting from the Ukrainians. It is them wrestling the initiative in the information domain, suggesting that there should be some form of leaders summit where this move to a peace settlement that Donald Trump has asked for within 50 days can be discussed. It'll be interesting to see how the Russians respond. I think they will find every excuse not to come in. Of course, the only other thing of substance that came out of that meeting yesterday was a further agreement to release 1,200 prisoners each. The second clip I want to point you at is this one of Donald Trump making a statement.
We just made a deal with the European Union where they're going to pay the United States of America 100% of the cost of all military equipment. They're going to ship it to the European Union, and then they'll distribute it, and much of it will go to Ukraine. It's been a long time since you've heard those words, because we're in for $350 billion, but now we send it to Europe, and Europe pays. And we had a tremendous NATO meeting a few weeks ago, and it was pretty amazing, actually, what happened. They agreed to go from 2% to 5%, and they had 2% where they didn't pay. They have 5% where they've already paid. That's a big difference. That's trillions of dollars, actually, trillions.
Now, in this, Donald Trump is gloating that he has managed to convince Europe to spend European money on buying US weapons instead of giving them for free. This has been a mantra that Donald Trump has pushed for quite some time, blaming the Biden administration for giving weapons away for free. It's nothing new. During the Second World War, there was Lend-Lease, and the UK only finished paying the Americans back for American support during the war. I think it was the mid-1980s that we've finally finished paying the bill. So I think Europe was very naive to believe that America would give weapons forever for free, especially when Donald Trump came in. And Donald Trump likes the art of the deal. He sees this as a deal. The big positive out of it is that he is continuing to talk of supporting Ukraine because someone else is paying. That is important. So the first of the videos I want to point you at this week is an interview that I did with Elliot Wilson. Elliot, a former clerk of the House of Commons. The clerks in the House of Commons are the administrators that make everything work, and he worked in the Defence Select Committee. And we had a good discussion and dive into the protests that are happening inside Ukraine around President Zelensky's alleged watering down of the powers of the anti-corruption organization that he'd set up to deal with the corruption that there had been throughout the Ukrainian government before Zelensky came into power, so that it could be removed and set the conditions for EU membership. Of course, to join the EU, corruption in government is something that the EU have been watching very closely indeed. The Ukrainians are a relatively young government, and Elliot explains this much more eloquently than I can, and explains how the fact that we had to go through the same growing processes whenever we had our democracy, but ours started back in 1300 and something. I'll let Elliot explain when that happens. And it was before the invention of social media, TikTok, YouTube, or the global news cycle. So President Zelensky has got problems. There is no doubt with that, but those will be exacerbated in the information domain by the Russians and stirred up in country by the Russians. We have to watch, and we have to hope that he gets through this safely and securely.
But yesterday we saw, the first major protests in Kyiv is how they've been billed out across some of the reporting. Some people have said they're anti-government. Other people are saying they're anti-corruption in looking at it. But it was triggered by President Zelensky signing a controversial new law that seems to weaken the independence of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Now, President Zelensky then came out to say that no, he signed this to try and take away the Russian influence in what was happening to try and deal with corruption. But corruption is such an important piece to maintain Western support for Ukraine. Do you think this is the first sort of little signs of something not quite right in the political structures inside Kyiv, given the fact that Zelensky has just done a sort of reshuffle of his cabinet and his government?
I think it's a concern, and I think it's a concern because a lot of European countries and America indeed will be concerned, and it will also undoubtedly be weaponized by people who never supported assisting Ukraine anyway. I think there's also an element of a lot of Westerners. It's like the first romance coming to an end. We idolize Zelensky to such a degree. We built him up in this Churchillian figure. And undoubtedly, he has very many extremely fine qualities. Physical bravery, apart from anything else. Resolution in terms of being a war leader. He's not perfect. I don't doubt that. And I don't think the sort of political structures of Ukraine are by any means perfect. It's still a relatively young country since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it may well be that he is not the ideal sort of platonic picture of a democratic leader. And I think that will play on a lot of European minds. I think my view is that we need to keep this in context. Zelensky may not be perfect, but we are dealing with a binary situation. We're dealing with either keeping Ukraine alive as a sovereign state, or it's ceasing to exist. And under those circumstances, that's not carte blanche to Zelensky to do whatever he likes. And it's not to say that we can overlook corruption or whatever. There's clearly a lot of work to be done there, certainly in terms of Ukraine ever joining the European Union further down the track. But I think we need to keep it in proportion. We are not fighting for a perfect democratic Ukraine. We're fighting for Ukraine to exist.
It's interesting, given where Ukraine was coming from, which was almost as corrupt as Russia, with oligarchs underpinning the political structures, and Zelensky being the first president to come in on an anti-corruption ticket. You can't fix it overnight. And he was unpopular at the beginning because all of those who were losing their money and losing their influence were fighting against him. And the Russian invasion sort of gave Zelensky that opportunity to try and take it further forward. So of course he's going to be tainted. But tell me what government across Europe or across the world isn't tainted by some form of corruption somewhere.
I agree. And I think the other problem that Zelensky has, and this is, not to anything like the same degree, but something that our current government has discovered, is that if you come to office with very high-minded ideals and professions of being so much better than your predecessors and whiter than white, that any slight taint, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that the problems that this government had early on are comparable to what's going on in Ukraine in terms of degree, but if you disappoint people then it just makes the situation all the worse. And I think that's why some people will be looking at Zelensky and thinking, well, hang on, we thought you were this sort of knight in shining armor, this crusader against corruption. And it turns out you're maybe 50% better than the last guy. Well, 50% better than the last guy is not bad. And we are dealing with democratic institutions which are incredibly young. I mean, we're less than 40 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And, Russia is a country which has no tradition of democratic institutions, representative democracy. And in terms of Russia, I mean, the old imperial Russia, so that would include Ukraine and the other former Soviet states. They're building virtually from nothing here. And it's all very well for us to say that, we have a public accounts committee which goes back to the middle of the 19th century. We have a parliament which can be traced back to the 13th century. And it's all very well for us to say, well, come on, you need to do it better than this, chaps. But we took a long time. And there's a limit to how quickly we can expect countries like Ukraine to come. I think it's about what we decide is their trajectory and what we decide is their degree of goodwill. And I think that is still probably in Zelensky's favor.
Yeah, well, we made all our mistakes before we had Times Radio broadcasting them out or social media in everyone's pocket. And therefore we could do it all quietly. And it was written in the history books by those that had a favourable view of how we dealt with things rather than an accurate view. So, yeah, difficult trying to develop a democracy today.
The second video I want to point you at this week is with an old friend, Sean Bell. And Sean is really giving an overview as to what's happening on the front line and talking about why the Russians are advancing so slowly, why even the ground that they're making is having absolutely no strategic impact whatsoever, and the fact that the Russians are losing so many troops that and the death rate is so high that it is becoming much more visible, not just to the other troops on the front line, but also when it comes back to commentary, getting back into Russia and Moscow and elsewhere. Vladimir Putin, even though he's making ground in tens or hundreds of meters, the cost that he is having to expend to do that is phenomenal. And in reality, when you look at what is happening from an overall perspective, not just taking the tactical point as your point of reference, looking at the operational level and the strategic level, Putin is on the back foot. The Ukrainians have got the initiative. Donald Trump is still supporting weapons going into Ukraine, paid for by the Europeans. Putin is losing.
If you play the long game, I mean, it's pretty clear that Russia does not care about casualties. You know, if you look back at the sort of campaign for us in Afghanistan, 20 years there, 454 of our brave soldiers lost their lives. And that was a big price for us to pay. If you look at Russia at the moment, they're well north of 1 million casualties now. No signs of abating. President Putin clearly doesn't care about that. But for the soldiers on the ground, it's very hard to continue pushing forward when so many of your colleagues or comrades are falling. And by all accounts, they're not clearing the bodies away. The front line is becoming a real mess. And it's becoming a terror area as well. So Ukraine has learnt a lot on the job, as it were. Where if I study history, as I do, most of the casualties on the front line were formed by artillery shells back in the day. Today, over 80%, close to 90% of the casualties are formed by drones. You know, first-person view drones that are carrying a hand grenade around, taking out people on the front line. They are terror weapons as well as being very effective. And I think you've also got the Russians with these barricade forces that are behind them, that if any of their soldiers turn around and flee, they get shot by their own soldiers. So it is a brutal attritional way of fighting wars. It's not good for morale. There's very little initiative used, and it's no great surprise, therefore, that the hugely brave and courageous stoical defense by the Ukrainians is massively slowing down the Russian advance. But let's be quite clear, the Russians are advancing, they are taking more and more ground, and if I was a military advisor to President Putin, I'd be going, Ukraine is struggling for arms, the Western alliance is looking a bit fragmented, it's not entirely clear where America and President Trump sits. I would be advising Putin to push for the whole of the summer. It's going to be a very difficult next few weeks for Ukraine.
I mean, yeah, and we're hearing that Russia is building up yet again more troops to try and double down on this summer offensive they've put together. Is there a reason to think, though, that Russia can turn this into any sort of breakthrough offensive with numbers alone?
Well, I'm always a bit sceptical about pontificating about what army tactics might be on the ground. But what I do get is plugged into a number of different briefings, and that's a question that pops up quite regularly and consistently. I'm being told that there is very little evidence that Russia is going to be able to make any sort of strategic breakthrough. And for some of the viewers who are less, or the listeners who are less, involved in military terms, it's a bit like plugging a dam. There are little bits of water flowing through, but are the Russians going to be able to blow a significant hole so that the dam collapses? The answer is no. That is not within their purview. Part of this, it's always more difficult on attack than it is defense because you have to leave your trenches. You have to, without cover, charge at the enemy. And of course, if you're not professionally trained, if you don't know how to use all arms, your tanks, your missiles and air forces, then it ends up just being brutally attritional. And that's exactly where Russia finds itself today. And what's most likely, one of the worries is that it looks like Russia wants to take the whole of Ukraine. That seems to be the main ambition. I can't find any military analysts that believe that's going to be remotely possible without some sort of extensive pause to allow Russia to rearm, recharge, and refresh itself ready for that. The question really is how far it needs to go before it's ready for that pause. And I think that's what most of us are asking at the moment.
And just finally on the ground, then on this battle on the ground, what state do you judge the Russian military to really be in at this point, considering the extent of the losses they've had to take up to this point to make those gains?
Well, I think, again, it's a difficult question to answer because in the early parts of the war, we would measure that question in terms of numbers. So we'd say, well, Russia has lost 3,000 main battle tanks, and most importantly, it's lost some of its most modern battle tanks. It's lost a lot of its fighter aircraft, and therefore it's becoming less and less effective. But the flip side of that is most armies take a while to get their battle readiness. In other words, the heat of battle and work out how to avoid the nerves and actually start operating effectively. Russia now has 3.5 years of combat experience under its belt. And some of its commanders, they know what works, what doesn't work. And that's where they are quite effective. And even if the war was to end, one of the risks to NATO is that if Russia was to redistribute its forces up across the eastern flank of NATO, they may not have a match in terms of Western equipment and technology and missiles and warfighting capability. But one thing they do have in spades is battlefield experience. And as several wars, particularly World War II, showed, that can be invaluable.
So that's all I have from Recap this week. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Please go and look at all of our videos. And of course, you can now get us on your favorite podcast channel. Just search for Times Rated Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.